Given that you've clicked on this video, I think it's safe to say that you've got some interest in true crime. And if, like me, you're a regular viewer of true crime content, you come across some really dark topics and really terrifying individuals. So let me ask you a question. What is the most terrifying case you've ever heard of? Ted Bundy? Jack the Ripper? The Yorkshire Ripper? Is the most terrifying case you think of that of a serial killer? Or are you more terrified by the more, shall we say, mundane type of killer? Like a family murderer, like Chris Watts? You know, the unassuming, the person who could literally be your next door neighbour, or even someone you live with. I'm going to tell you mine. The most terrifying, horrifying case I've ever come across is one from the 19th century, and that is Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes. Wasn't even his real name. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, and he was only 34 years old when he was executed. But in his 34 years, he had a massive amount of crimes under his belt. He'd been the subject of over 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. He'd committed insurance frauds, swindling, forgery. He had 3 or 4 bigamous marriages. He was even a horse thief. But all of those things combined don't even scratch the surface when we think about the amount of murder he committed. The tabloid press in the 19th century, it's pretty much like it is today. The crimes of H.H. Holmes, I think, over the years have been maybe exaggerated, or maybe they haven't. Maybe some of the details that the tabloid press latched onto when his case was brand new were exaggerated. But maybe we don't even know the tip of the iceberg about the real things that went on in the life and the murders of H.H. Holmes. While he was awaiting execution, he confessed to 27 murders, some of which were lies, because some of the people that he confessed to murdering were actually still alive. Much of the exaggeration and fabrication around the life and the crimes of H.H. Holmes was surrounding what the tabloid press at the time called the murder castle, or the hotel that H.H. Holmes built. One that was filled with torture chambers, gas chambers, peepholes, cellars, corridors that led to nowhere. It was the absolute stuff of a horror movie. And actually, probably many horror movies have been based on the murder castle. But it was hyperbolic, right? This tabloid journalism. And historians who've tried to get to the bottom of the life and crimes of H.H. Holmes have always hit stumbling blocks, that it's impossible to determine what is fact and what is fiction. And because Holmes lied so much about his life and his crimes, I don't think we'll ever really know what happened to all of those people that he murdered. Now, actually, he was executed for the murder of just one person, and that was his business partner, Benjamin Pitzel. But it's believed that he killed Pitzel's children, as well as 3 of his own mistresses, the child of one of those mistresses, and the sister of another. One of the things that's terrifying about H.H. Holmes is that he would murder anyone who stood in his way. His business partner, his business partner's children. The lack of empathy, the lack of morality, the manipulation, and the willingness to step over anybody who gets in your way, even if they're a child. H.H. Holmes is a perfect example, in my opinion, of the type of person that I want to discuss in this video. And that is the role of the dark triad of personality traits that makes some people dangerous, terrifying, and become killers. Let's get into it all. The dark triad is a collection of 3 interrelated, negative, malevolent personality traits. Those of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. The term dark triad was coined by psychologists Paulus and Williams in the year 2002. But although Paulus and Williams were the first people to put these triad of personality constellations together and said that if these are high in the same person, then you've got someone who is potentially very dangerous. The three constructs that make the dark triad each has its own research base that's independent and robust in its own right. Narcissism, for example, has got a wealth of research behind it, both in social and clinical research domains. Narcissistic personality disorder is diagnosable under the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Research on narcissism has identified two dimensions, the grandiose and the vulnerable. Nearly all of the research on the dark triad has focused on grandiose narcissism, but that doesn't mean to say that vulnerable narcissists aren't important to consider as well. Grandiose narcissists are people who are characterized by wanting to be the life and soul of the party. Everybody look at me, like a dark type of exhibitionism. They lack modesty, they lack humility, they're dominant, they love themselves above all others. Perhaps they lack the ability to love anyone except themselves. But not all narcissists are grandiose. Some narcissists, although they have the characteristic selfishness, they are more subtle. They're very distrusting. They're less exhibitionistic. And perhaps the vulnerable narcissist is the one who's actually more dangerous because they're more unassuming. People perhaps get suckered in. They're able to worm their way into someone's life in a way that a grandiose person might not be. I don't know, that's just my opinion. Machiavellianism is perhaps the least well-known of the three personality constructs that make up the dark triad. Machiavellianism is the need for power and manipulation. People who measure high in Machiavellianism are going to get what they want regardless of who they have to manipulate to get there. And then we have perhaps the most well-known and the darkest of the three personality constructs of the dark triad, and that is psychopathy. Different studies in prisons as well as in community and student samples have all shown that people who measure higher in psychopathy are more likely to commit crime. Indeed, the dark triad as a whole is a prime candidate of personality traits that are relevant in understanding why people commit crimes. The antagonistic and selfish core of all three of the triad personality constructs could influence involvement in a large number of antisocial and criminal activities, ranging from drug offences, assaults, forgery, robbery, fraud, property theft, as well as the ultimate sin, that of taking someone else's life. According to one study published by Miller et al. In 2010, it makes sense to think of the dark triad as two constructs, in addition to a more adaptive constellation of psychopathy and grandiose narcissism. There's a second dark triad characterized by features of borderline personality disorder, vulnerable narcissism, people who've got a really fragile self-esteem, but still lacking the sensitivity towards others and the lack of empathy towards others. These people are vulnerable. They have associations with insecure attachments. Perhaps they've had bad parenting as a child. Perhaps they've had childhood trauma. But it's absolutely not the case that everybody who goes on to commit crime, particularly violent crime, has had a horrible childhood. In fact, there are many myths surrounding murder, particularly serial killers, that perhaps it would be useful to address. not all killers are dysfunctional loners. The majority of killers, in fact, the majority of people who become the most horrendous of serial killers, are not reclusive social misfits who live alone, who stand out like a sore thumb. They are not monsters, and they don't appear strange. They're not the bogeyman, because of their ability to command attention, their ability to manipulate, to be very successful in life. Many people who go on to become serial killers, as a result of those dark triad of personality traits, are out there in their communities from all walks of life. They might have families, homes, be gainfully employed, be very successful in their careers, just normal members of the community. Let's pick a couple of examples. Robert Yates, for example, who killed 17 prostitutes in the Spokane, Washington area during the 1990s. Was married with 5 kids, lived in a middle-class neighborhood, and was a decorated US Army National Guard helicopter pilot. Yates was hiding in plain sight. He even managed to bury one of his victims in his yard, beneath his bedroom window. What about the Green River killer, Gary Ridgway, who confessed to killing 48 women over a 20-year time period in the Seattle, Washington area? He'd been married 3 times and was still married at the time of his arrest. He was employed as a truck painter for 32 years. He attended church. He read the Bible at home and at work, but he had a secret life. Like Yates, he was frequently picking up prostitutes. And would anybody have imagined what he was doing? What about Dennis Rader, or BTK? Killed 10 victims around Wichita in Kansas. He sent 16 written communications to the news media over a 30-year period, taunting the police and the public, but yet still nobody knew who this killer was. He was married with 2 kids, was a Boy Scout leader, served honourably in the US Air Force, and was employed as a very mild-mannered local government official. I could go on and on. We could talk about Ted Bundy. We could talk about Israel Keys. It's absolutely not the case that serial killers have got debilitating mental conditions, but neither is it true that they are evil geniuses. Although many are extremely clever and conniving and devious, that enables them to evade capture for so long. As a group of a whole, serial murderers are no more or no less intelligent than the average, but they are more likely than the average to suffer from a variety of personality disorders, including psychopathy, antisocial personality, narcissistic personality disorder, and be incredibly selfish and manipulative. That's why the dark triad constellation of personality constructs is very relevant when we think about serial killers as a whole. But it's probably because we have an interest in true crime that when we think about murderers, we think about serial killers. Right? This video has meandered into discussing serial killers rather than the more mundane type of crime or murder even. The latest in a long line of family murderers that has been discussed in the true crime community is that of Alec Murdaugh. And in my opinion, Alec is a prime example of someone who displays a dark triad of personality constructs. But yet he hid in plain sight for so long. At his trial, witness after witness after witness said, I didn't know this person at all. The amount of financial crimes, the fraud, the theft that he'd been doing over many, many years, he had this ability to charm people. He had this ability to hide the millions of dollars that he was stealing from his law partners, his clients, his firm, and his family. At his sentencing, Alec professed that he was innocent. But one of his brothers, Randy Murdoch, has come out and said he believes that Alec is lying and he knows more about those murders. But perhaps still isn't quite able to believe that his brother could shoot his wife and literally blow the brains out of his own son's head. Maggie and Paul Murdoch were killed in an extreme fashion, and perhaps it's hard for people to understand that a so-called loving father and husband would do that to his family. That was one of the leading lines of the defence strategy. Alec loved his family. He wouldn't do this. But yet a jury didn't agree and convicted him of double murder. In my opinion, Alec Murdoch shows the Machiavellianism, the narcissism, and the lack of empathy that constitute the dark triad of personality traits. His ability to charm people, to look people in the eye and lie to them, made him a very, very successful criminal over many years. All self-serving, all to keep this illusion of this affluent lifestyle. While all the time Alec was a functional addict, spending a huge amount of money on oxycodone pills. But I think probably what we heard at the trial is the tip of the iceberg of what Alec was really getting up to, in my opinion, over many years. I don't think his family knew him. I don't think his clients knew him. I don't think his law partners knew him. But he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and he can jump up and down and profess his innocence. The only people who are going to listen to him now are his fellow prisoners, and I doubt that they are as welcoming an audience as he's been used to. Alec Murdoch was born into a multi-generational family of lawyers. He's never had to worry about money. He's never had to worry about being respected. But now he starts from the bottom up. How long will Alec Murdoch survive in prison is a question that I'm curious about. Will Alec be able to charm the birds from the trees from behind bars? I doubt it. Let me know what you think about the dark triad and its role in understanding the psychology of murder. And let me know what the most terrifying case is that you've come across. Thankfully, murder is rare. We overrepresent in our heads the amount of murder that goes on. As true crime connoisseurs, that's what we are consuming on a day-by-day basis. Why is a whole nother question. Bye, guys.